Hi, welcome everyone to your first session of the year. I'm Jo, and I'm going to be chairing. I'm a food grower, growing food in Hampshire, and I've also been mobilising on anti-oppression work in the movement for the past few years. Just to check that you're all in the right session, we're here on rerouting agroecology, and we are talking about the pertinence of stopping agroecology from being greenwashed and losing its politicized meaning. We're talking about how the weakening of the word serves as a liberalizing force in the movement. We're talking about how agroecology is nothing less than a global struggle and a global social movement, about how it's growing food and it's also so much more than growing food. And I'm really excited to hear from our speakers today on this topic. We're going to be doing some presentations from the four speakers who will introduce themselves in a moment, and then we'll move into a question and discussion session between us, and then we'll open to questions from the audience. So yeah, without further ado, we will start, and I'll ask the question to Michel. In your experience, what does it mean to build a social movement for agroecology?
Okay, and the origins? Yeah. Should I go there?
If you'd like to, we can
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear? Yep. Sorry? These work? Yep, okay. I was told to come up here. I was also asked to talk a little bit about the origins and history of agroecology and then link it to global struggles in the South. So, I think it's fair to say that over the last 90 years, the academic literature on agroecology has largely emphasized the role of scientists in studying and developing agroecology. But agroecological practices are much, much older, and they really have their roots in indigenous and peasant societies in Africa, the Americas, Asia, Australia, Europe, and also Polynesia. And it's noteworthy also that many indigenous communities that strive for self-determination don't actually use the term agroecology, especially those that are more dependent on hunting and gathering than on agriculture. And their land stewardship practices and food provisioning practices are much more based on a kin-centric ecology in which indigenous peoples view both themselves and nature as part of a family of relatives. So the plants, the animals, the stones, the sky, the wind, they're part of this ancestry which is shared with indigenous people. So it's a much more relational concept of agroecology, in which relatives include plants, animals, water, and the natural elements of their ecosystem. But although indigenous communities and peasant communities don't necessarily use the term agroecology, their long-term land use practices do illustrate many principles of agroecology. For example, the use of biodiversity in the form of multi-species polycultures, intercrops, genetic mixtures, agroforestry systems, mixed farming at different scales, from the farm to the whole landscape. And indeed, these approaches really work to diversify the ecosystems and wider landscapes in which food provisioning systems are embedded. So indigenous and peasant land use practice have created mosaics of agricultural areas made up of wild and cultivated patches of biodiversity at multiple scales. That's their version of rewilding, but with people, with architects in the landscape. Now, if we zoom forward and come to our century, over the last 40 years, the definition of agroecology has evolved through different phases. Initially, scientists who were involved, that was in the 80s, viewed agroecology as a set of methods and practices for the design of sustainable agriculture. They focused very much on the farm plot. Then they slightly moved to a larger system, the agroecosystem, incorporating social, economic, and technical concerns. But it was only until the year 2000 that agroecology as a scientific discipline broadened out to encompass the whole food system. So we talked about the ecology of the food system, not just about, the biology part, not just the technical part, but also the institutional and policy frameworks and cultural elements that make up that system. So agroecology started to embrace a much more holistic approach, in contrast to much more partial and atomistic approaches, which still prevail in much of current science. But in the 21st century, agroecology also widened its focus much, much more to look at the global food system and explore alternative food networks, food and fiber networks. We talk about food, but we should always remember fibers. And these food and fiber networks essentially relocalize production, processing, and consumption within territories. And the approach reinforces connections between producers and consumers by integrating these practices with alternative market relationships and short food chains within specific territories. Now, that much more holistic understanding of agroecology has been adopted by a growing number of indigenous people, activist scholars, and other social actors who are aligned with the food sovereignty movement and the right to food. And food sovereignty advocates in particular see agroecology as vital for the regeneration of local ecologies and economies. Speaking in 2015 at the International Forum on Agroecology in Yeleni, Ibrahim Koulibaly, a West African peasant leader, stated there is no food sovereignty without agroecology, and certainly agroecology will not last without a food sovereignty policy that backs it up, and I'm quoting him there. So food sovereignty movements like La Via Campesina are claiming agroecology as a bottom-up construction of knowledge that needs to be supported rather than led by science and policy. And they favor a transformative agroecology based on the on the redesign and functional diversification of agroecosystems, as well as territorialized or re-territorialized local and regional markets. And re-embedding autonomous food systems within specific territories is viewed as essential for change, political, economic, cultural change. And that transformative agroecology, you'll quickly remark, sharply contrasts with those of mainstream organizations who seek to co-opt agroecology and ensure its compatibility with the prevailing agri-food regime by promoting, for example, input substitution approaches that maintain dependency on corporate suppliers of external inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, antibiotics, etc., but also on global commodity market. So, as such, this vision of agroecology grounded in food sovereignty is fundamentally distinct from the selective incorporation of a few agroecological practices, cherry picking, within a productivist model of agriculture that conforms to the dominant agri-food regime. Things like climate-smart agriculture, sustainable intensification, and agrotech or agri-ecotech that combines organic farming with elements of the fourth industrial revolution and digital farming. And these forms of junk agroecology was a term chosen by civil society groups, and I think it's very appropriate. They really start from the premise that productivity per unit of land needs to increase in a sustainable manner, and changes must fit within the dominant agri-food regime. And moreover, these co-opted versions of agroecology usually reflect and reinforced an entrenched structure of gender inequality, exploitation, and dispossession, process of accumulation through dispossession. So these powerful promoters of business as usual really seek to lock in agroecology into transition pathways and forms of greenwashing that are designed to sustain capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Now, what does this mean in the global south for global struggles for independence and sovereignty? I just want to quickly close by focusing on agroecology and struggles of the global south. I think a peasant and people's agroecology is rooted in several struggles of the global south, at least three I could mention now. Struggles for decolonization, mainly because agroecology is rooted in the affirmation of people's knowledge, farmers' knowledge, indigenous knowledge, food artisans' knowledge, and also in the principle of epistemic or cognitive justice that affirms or rejects any hierarchies between different knowledge systems. The second area, which is important in struggles for the global south, is the role of agroecology in fighting unequal exchange between the global north and the south. A people's agroecology works for transformation towards more just and sustainable agri-food systems and against global accumulation through dispossession. It's probably good to remind ourselves that global capitalism's embedded unequal relationship between the center and the periphery has allowed the global north to appropriate around $62 trillion from the global south between 1960 and 2018. And a lot of that has been due to trade in food and agricultural commodities, unequal exchange, and the role agroecology can play in reversing that. And the next area important for struggles in the global south is what Samir Amin, a Tunisian economist, talked about, the need to delink the periphery from the core by emphasizing collective political agency for self-determination. The agroecology movement wants more economic democracy, in which peripheries delink from the core to regain autonomy and sovereignty. So that's the politics of emancipation. And in large measure, this delinking towards a more polycentric world depends on the renewal of non-capitalist forms of peasant agriculture and agroecological transformations for territorial agri-food systems. I think my time's up, so I'll leave it there and come back to some of these points after, and we'll try and unpack them together. But thank you.
That's perfect timing. Thank you. Thanks so much for giving that broader context. I'm going to pass to B now. And B, if you could please introduce yourself as well.
Yes, certainly. Oh, am I meant? Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. Thank you. It feels like a real honour and privilege to be standing here and speaking about agroecology after Michel, because I'm going to be taking you on a brief, indulgent trip down memory lane. My name is Rebecca Laughton, by the way, or B, and I work for Land Workers Alliance. And I first came across the term agroecology in 1998 when I was studying for a master's in sustainable agriculture at Y College. And I was already very committed to the principles of organic farming, and I'd worked on a couple of market gardens and was really keen on that. But I was quite troubled by the problem of trying to make organic food affordable to everyone. I was troubled by the fact that organic food attracts a premium, and that just didn't feel quite right to me. So going to an agroecology lecture by Graham Woodgate was a really transformative moment in my evolution towards this work. And I was really struck by the principle and the idea that you could be producing food in a really sustainable way to feed everyone, that the principles of equality, economic equality, gender equality were absolutely baked in right from the word go. At that time in 1998, there wasn't an agroecology movement in the UK. But in preparing for this talk, it's been making me reflect about so many of the things I've done between then and now, and actually how many of the roots of UK agroecology and things that I was attracted to have led to what we're doing as a movement now. And it's why I feel so passionate about this particular talk in explaining why agroecology is a movement that's really rooted in political and social transformation. So I'm going to just try and skip very briefly through some of the key movements that have led to agroecology in the UK. So I've just, what I've done is I've tried to connect the principles of agroecology or peasant agroecology to some of the key movements. So I'll try and pick out some of those principles as we go through. So there's obviously the ecological and low impact element, the political and social, well, I won't read it all out. So the key, I mean, there are many other parts to the movement in the UK, but these are the ones that I've picked out as being particularly significant. The organic and biodynamic movements, the permaculture movement, local food links, low impact development, the transition movement, all leading to the first UK food sovereignty gathering in July 2012, which was when Landworkers Alliance was founded. So, yes, I mean, by adopting the language of agroecology, I really think it's important to pay tribute to both the organic and the biodynamic movements, which are very much movements in themselves, as well as being certified systems for producing sustainable food. They both focus on health in soil, plant and animals, and in particular biodynamics has a real spiritual element, which I think really connects with the spiritual element of agroecology and the indigenous systems that really see food production as being rooted in a much bigger world picture, cosmic picture. They're both holistic systems that avoid artificial chemical inputs. But in 1973, in order to prevent greenwash, it became necessary to start certifying organic and biodynamic produce because there was an increasing demand and there were more and more claims of food being produced to organic standards when sometimes it wasn't. And it was absolutely necessary to bring in a certification system. And I think this is a really, really vital tool, but in a sense, it meant that both organic and biodynamic became a bit less flexible, which is one of the things that you really need within a movement. You've got to have that flexibility and adaptability. And it also meant that organic food started to attract a premium because it could be marketed as such. And that's what started to create it as being a more exclusive form of food. So at the same time, there was the permaculture movement, which was evolving. It started off in Australia. And this is very much more a grassroots design movement founded on the principles of earth care, fair shares, and people care, which are effectively principles that can translate well across to agroecology and are really embedded in it. It applies beyond agriculture into living systems, and within permaculture, as within agroecology, people are very much part of the system. People aren't separate to nature, people are part of nature. And it's been interesting in recent years to see the regenerative farming movement actually really was brought into the UK partly by the permaculture movement to apply permaculture principles at a much more farm scale. So I think it's really important to remember that. So after I finished at Y, my first job was within the local food links movement. So this was a movement that was really taking off in the late 90s. The Soil Association had their Food Futures project in various different parts of the UK. And it was very grounded in Local Agenda 21 and the Rio Earth Summit, So various councils were looking at how they could become more sustainable, and food was a vital part of that. My first job was with Somerset Food Links, which was a partnership between local authorities and the NHS Trust in Somerset. And they were piloting, well, we were piloting 5 a day. They set up the early farmers markets at Somerset Food Links and set up the Somerset Local Food Direct Delivery Service, which was actually one of the really early door-to-door delivery of organic and local food services. So, and then that also gave rise, lots of local food links projects, to community-supported agriculture, which again brings in the social and economic dimensions of the sustainable food movement. Also in parallel to all of this was the low-impact development movement, and this was actually really addressing the need for people who wanted to work on the land to have affordable housing. And Tinker's Bubble, where I spent 5 years in the early 2000s, was one of the early low-impact communities. And that was very much about addressing the housing needs of rural workers and having affordable housing needs. It was also addressing access to land issues, the need to live in community and collaborate with one another. Oh, right, okay, I'd better speed on through. So the transition movement was also a key part of the roots of agroecology in the UK. And this all led to, in 2012, after a couple of the founders of Land Workers Alliance had been to the La Via Campesina gathering in Indonesia, the first meeting of the UK food sovereignty movement, the first UK food sovereignty gathering in 2012. I'm going to move quickly onto this final slide because this is actually where I really want to make the point that agroecology, organic, regenerative agriculture, and all those other terms, they're all really valuable. It's essential that we've got legally protected terms such as organic and biodynamic, but it's also really important that we've got flexible terms which represent movements such as agroecology and regenerative that are permeable and that bring principles and values. You can't legislate really for affordable food. I mean, it would be ideal if we could, and we're very much fighting for right to food, but a lot of the principles that we're fighting for within the movement, it's very difficult to legislate for in a certification scheme like organic certification. But that doesn't mean that organic isn't equally important as a way to make sure that food that's being sold through, for example, supermarkets, is protected as being a legally certified term. The thing I really want to leave you with is the sense that we really, really need to all be working together. That came through so clearly in the opening plenary, that sense of solidarity. There are so many things that we're trying to overcome, and if we start to be nitpicking about different terms between ourselves within our movement, we're not going to be able to actually address the bigger challenges which we so urgently need to address. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I think we've got to be looking to achieve what we achieve within the bounds of reality, but we've got to be working together in order to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bea, for the zooming in to the UK context, following the wider picture. I'm going to pass over to Anuka now.
Hi. This one? Yes, okay. Hello? This one is working? Yeah. I'm a little nervous here. This is my first time in UK. I'm Anuka from Sri Lanka. I'm part of the International Coordination Committee of La Via Campesina, and also I'm a women person in Sri Lanka. I like to speak on behalf of the La Via Campesina and also my experience in Sri Lanka, because it's agroecology part of our life. as a third generation of the agrarian reform in Sri Lanka, I have so many difficulties how we build the movement through the agroecology. That's why I am here. As professionally, I'm software engineer. But 2015, I saw my people dying with the chronic kidney diseases. It's called unknown chronic kidney diseases. But with my colleagues, we start the research. Why it's happening in the country? Because we are living in the agrarian settlement. It's starting with the 1964, it's my settlement. At all others in my region, we have so many agrarian reform under the big water reserve. Because water is coming with the up countries, like with the, you all know Ceylon tea. Ceylon tea, they use a lot of glyphosate. That's why, and also our farmers, we use a lot of chemicals as called Roundup. It's the commercial name. We start the researching what's happening with our people. Every villages, people are dying without sense of the kidney disease. We start what's the cause of that, because it's not the unknown. That's why I become a part of the farmer in my village. I need to fight for my people. We start thinking we need to revise the system of the agriculture. We start the campaign against the CKDU. We need to real solution. That's why we start campaign against the banning the glyphosate Roundup in 2015. We had a huge campaign against that. That's the starting point in my level as a young people who start the campaign. We need real solution. We need to change the agriculture system in our country. We campaigning that we change the political regime because of our demand of 2015. We bring the new government as demanding the banning the agrochemicals, especially glyphosate. 2015, that is the first country we banned all glyphosate, all the countries. Other countries, they have some kind of legal measure, like some Latin American countries, they ban like a provincial level. But as a Sri Lanka, we banned in all country. That's the starting point, it's my level. But previous, my parents and my grandparents, they also start agroecology, but they didn't know the sense of the agroecology. But they doesn't want to allow the using the chemical in their fields, because my grandparents, in the 80s, they start the campaigning using the urea and other chemicals, nitrogen fertilizer. But my grandparent doesn't want to do. How it's like a very related to Sri Lanka now, what's happening situation in now, because it's all, we are like 70% of people who living in Sri Lanka, it's a very rural areas. Still, we are living in rural area. Our urban population is like a 30%. But with the new generation, because of this capitalist system, they start the promoting starting part of the nitrogen fixing fertilizer. That's how it's become like that. And also, it's not only that, not only the fertilizer. They using the seeds. They starting the new seeds, like we call IR8. It's coming with the Philippines, like ERI, is the Rice Research Institute. They introducing rice seeds. But in the history, you can look in their website. They saying, thank you, Sri Lanka, giving 2,400 some seed variety for our research institute. But nowadays, we are losing our capacity to have our native seeds. That's why the starting point of against to the banning the agrochemicals. That's our starting point, the agroecology. As the movement, we saying it's not the practice. It's the political demand. To us, we need to change our agriculture system, because who create this system? Because it's like a capital system. They introducing their own fertilizer, their own seed, their own pest. That's how we are losing our own soil in our lands. We against capital accumulation. We against who create the capital, but we cannot accept our capital. We are demanding We are the creator of the capital, but we cannot access our capital. We are against the system of the capitalism. That's why we are demanding agroecology as the political demand. It's not the technical work. It's totally political demand we are doing. That's why we are starting agroecology as our political demand. In Sri Lanka, we're starting point that against to the chemical banding, starting the chemical banding, and we are promoting agroecology. It's my sense, as a rural women, as practicing agroecology, you all know Sri Lanka is the huge problem with the debt crisis because we have a bad practice of the, our governance. That's why we are in the huge problem with the debt. We are starting with the women's who promoting agroecology. Why? Because Sri Lanka GDP controlling by the women. I like to say that, but it's so bad. Because rural women cannot access the land. They are not part of the agriculture new way. Because with the new agrarian reform, they are giving land title for the men. With all government's policies under the agrarian settlement, under the men. That's why we are asking, we are the part of the creating the capital. We are the part of the GDP. As a garment workers, as a Middle East housemaids, we are creating as a tea pluckers, we are creating the GDP. That's why we start against the debt, especially in the rural sector. We have a microfinance debt. I don't know you're familiar with that word because it's like a household debt. It's like a huge crisis in South Asia. Every women's collect together and they are starting to get the company loans, very high interest. They are losing their power to access to land. That's why they're getting that microfinance loan. We start campaigning at the same way. We against all kind of chemicals. We start against the debt. We start campaigning against the microfinance debt. That's why we're saying we need our own sovereignty to decide our economy. We start agroecology. But how to access the land, that's also issue. But we have a huge campaign against the microfinance debt. We have a good sense with the farmers organization because Sri Lanka, World Bank promoting the farmers union under the government. It's like a threat for us who has a campaign against to the agroecology, like promoting the agroecology. We start that campaign, we against microfinance debt. We really need a real solution, yeah. That's why we start campaign with the agroecology. That's why we said agroecology is the real solution for the rural sector. It's with the economy, we need our autonomy to access the economy. We need autonomy to access the resources, not only the lands. We fight for our own sovereignty. That's why we promoting agroecology. I'm sending this on not only the Sri Lankan, because in the Africa, as Latin America, as a La Via Campesina, we are fighting for that. Agroecology is the root for the food sovereignty. We really need to understand the reality of the food sovereignty. We need to go through the agroecology. Agroecology, not the techniques, it's the way of living. That's why I want to say thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us a tangible example of how agroecology is about resistance and is about struggle and is about liberation. I'm going to pass now to Ed.
Hey. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what agroecology means for land workers in the UK specifically, or really just my own experience. So I guess, like a lot of land workers, I mean, I'm a veg grower, and I've also got a herd of conservation grazing cattle. And I guess, like a lot of us doing land work, against the industrial models, I didn't really think too much about what to call it. I just knew that I didn't want to be following these kind of really destructive methods that I'd seen. And I guess I got into farming in general because I wanted to be outside. I wanted to be doing something that I could see a long trajectory of. It wasn't just like short-term sort of work. I wanted to be really invested, really rooted in something. But yeah, I never thought too much about what to call it. I also, when I started my market garden, didn't think about certifying it as organic either. And actually, interestingly, we're now going to be putting our land into conversion, and that's because of the ELMS provision and a big win that B was quite instrumental with, which is getting the sub 5 hectare limit taken out. So now, with our 5 hectares of rented land, we can put that into conversion. And so anyway, that's just like a little detail about the certification. So yeah, I wasn't thinking too much about what we called it until I started getting involved in the Land Workers Alliance, and started kind of thinking about how we described the work we were doing. And that actually led to, eventually I was able to go to Colombia last year, where I met Anuka, and Joe and I went, which really was like a life-changing trip for me. Certainly really changed the way I was thinking about the work we're doing. Both in the conference, meeting La Via Campesina people and seeing that the commonalities between what we're doing as land workers here and what is happening on the global, how people are addressing the kind of global issues that you were talking about. These are common everywhere. So yeah, I think there was one particular moment actually in Colombia, which was after the conference, and we visited an autonomous sort of, or semi-autonomous peasant community that had taken their land back from, through direct action and also political, legal action. And they'd taken a load of land that had been sold off to an Irish paper company. They reclaimed it and then had resettled it. It was their ancestral territory. And were living there in a truly agroecological kind of setup. And I was having this chat with one of these people from this community, and they said, what's it like farming in the UK? And I was kind of thinking about it and thinking, well, it's really stressful. And they were like, oh, so like why, And I was saying, well, I just think a lot about how we're going to pay the bills, how we're going to generate the revenue we need, like we're renting, I don't have total land security. And they sort of said, well, is it your territory? Is it where you're from? And I was like, well, yeah, it's sort of my territory, it's where I live, I love it, I care about everything that's there, from the native plants to the plants that we're bringing in, to the wildlife, the red kites, all of it. And they said, well, you should just take it. So I sort of came back with that in my head. And so, yeah, I'm going to try and draw this together then into, to kind of draw a thread of meaning out of all of this ramble. So if a lot of what we do is about reaction to something that we know is destructive, and I think this whole conference is like that, isn't it? It's saying we are an alternative. Then we need to somehow square that with the fact that we're all forced to live, or we all live in this capitalist system that is part of everything in our lives, right? And trying to balance those imperatives, like trying to just live as a person in our society, but also do things in a way that's morally acceptable, or even like, I mean, we're all radical, right? I think every farmer who's farming without using chemicals and huge tractors and, not stamping themselves on their environment, that is a radical act. And I guess trying to think of ways that we can look after ourselves whilst bringing in as many of the kind of the tenets of agroecology that we've heard about, the kind of embeddedness in our communities, nourishing the land, nourishing ourselves, if we can bring that into our farms, then that's an incredible thing. But we also need to be kind to ourselves and say we also need to keep up the payroll and fix the tractor. And it's really tough to balance those two things. So I guess I was asked to say some of the ways that our farm, Ed's Veg, which is in the southeast, some of the things we've tried to do to be agroecological. And I'd say it's an aspiration, sort of. Agroecology for us is an aspiration because of the kind of inherent difficulty of doing that in the belly of the beast of capitalism here. So some of the things that we've tried to do is working with the local food banks. We have a box scheme, and if people go on holiday, they can just put the money that they would have spent on their veg box for that week into a pot. We then use that pot to supply wholesale veg to the food bank. It's a really easy thing to do. It redistributes a bit of wealth in the community. So that's something we do. Another thing that we do is we use as much of the local materials as we can, and that's just because it's a small little farm and it's an area that I grew up in, and so if we need fence posts, we go to the chestnut coppice. If we need compost, we use wood chip. We try not to bring in too many inputs from too far away. So there's that. There's welcoming nature into the farm, from mammals to coleoptera to, to having flowers, to having leaving as many trees around as we can, or planting more hedgerows, all that sort of stuff. So those things. There's also something about not locking our farm gate. I mean, we lock it at night, but like in the daytime, we live there on site, and just saying to the local people, look, if you're passing by, if we're busy, but you can just wave, and then if you can always come in and just have a look round. And it's like, it's not, I don't feel like it's my land. I feel like the work there is mine and is shared by the team of people that work there. But like the place itself, agroecology has to be about commons. It has to be about sharing land. And so I guess just to quickly wrap it up, if we want to, and I don't think we need to contrast organic with agroecology, and we are all part of this solution. We're all, like B said, like we are on the team, we're the goodies. But I think that agroecology, for me, what I've learned after Colombia and after just chatting to so many inspiring people, and I've kind of realized that what agroecology is about people in the landscape. It's about community. It's about nature and people and justice and internationalism and all of these things. And that's incredibly exciting. It's really daunting, but it's really, really exciting. And it's fundamentally about resisting the urge to define yourself by the capitalist systems that you are present in, because that's how the world works, right? It's like not letting that define what you do. So yeah, that's what I've got to say on that. And yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you for giving us a bit of a context of the market gardening in the UK, and also for raising the tension about operating as farmers, as people who hold agroecological values, whilst also living under a capitalist system, because it is a tension, especially in the West. So we're going to move on to the discussion part of the session now, and just opening up space for all the speakers to answer any of these questions that feel right. I guess because, Ed, you just raised this tension, we could start with the question on how do we practice the justice and liberation-oriented values of agroecology whilst still operating under capitalism? Got a few mics here.
Oh, am I? Are you directing that at me? It's really, really difficult. But I think that this movement has so much creativity in it that I think people are rising to the challenge. And it does take a huge amount of creativity and ingenuity, as well as speaking truth to power. I think one of the things I've really noticed at the Oxford Real Farming Conference and in the wider movement over the last couple of years is that people are being a lot more open about the challenges of working on the land, trying to make a living from it. And I think that the creation of a really caring, supportive movement where it's all right to talk about the challenge is a very important part of it. So, yes, I think creativity and sensitivity and support of each other are really key, as well as speaking truth to power. And really, I mean, one of the things that we do within Land Workers Alliance is that we're trying to advocate for people who are working on the ground, running agricultural businesses, trying to make sure that some of the resources flow towards these farmers, because these are farmers who are doing this because it's the right thing. They're not doing it for the money. I mean, obviously you have to make a living from being a farmer, but people are motivated because of a much wider imperative than simply making money. So speaking truth to power about the challenges of trying to do this so that actually the public money for public goods rhetoric really does deliver that public money for public goods, I think is the other half of it. But I'll pass on.
Yes. I also like to add some point, especially it's with the capitalist world, it's not easy to have a resist, kind of bring the agroecology. But internationalism is the way to understand, because that's why Lavia, we believe globalized struggle, globalized hope, because we learn each other. Like mostly is Lavia pattern of the understanding and learning, it's the person to person. Like he mentioned, we have a good experience. We learning each other, especially thinking about the agroecology. In Sri Lanka, we lost a lot of things. And we trying to learn from India because they have a zero budget natural farming. ZBNF we call. They have a real good practicing still now. And also the thinking about the political way. It's Latin America. They are very good to do resistance. We learn from them. That's why it's like a globalized movement. As Lavia, we believe we can learn from each other because we are the people who understand the reality. We really need to come together. That's why we need to unite. And we know we are divided, but we need to come together to move forward. But that is the most important part. As Lavia believe, that's why it's challenging because we are very creative, but capitalism is more creative than us because they move forward very well. But we know how to crack down them because that, like a WTO, they're always part of with the government. In Sri Lanka, we have a huge experience as the third world country, as Africa, as Latin America. But as a people, we understand our power. In 2021, we kick out our president in Sri Lanka. We know our power as a people. That's why we will need to come together. That's the most important part. As agroecology, we are the feeders, the world. Still, as a small-scale farmers, small-scale food producers, we are feeding the world. That's why coming years, this year, we calling the Nielani Third Forum in India or Sri Lanka, maybe, I like to say that. Maybe it's coming. That's why we really need to come together as the food producers. We are running the world without food. We cannot do anything. We are asking, we are demanding our rights as access the resources. We are reducing the carbon. That's why most important part, we need to come together. Diversity, but we need to unite to work. Globalize the struggle, globalize hope.
Thank you, Anuka. Thank you so much for bringing in internationalism and the importance of learning from each other. Like the resistance is already alive, and yeah, thank you so much. Did anyone want to say any more on that point, on that question? I think you said very well. Okay. We do have more questions. Another question that I might just merge a couple of them is about talking a bit more about the link between food sovereignty and agroecology, and then as a kind of sub-point, talking about what role the state should play in building a people-powered and grassroots agroecology movement.
Hello again. I'm going to try and step back a little bit and think about broad system change as a complementary perspective to what's been well said by other contributors to this panel. We know we have a polycrisis, and we know that business as usual is going to head nowhere except a disaster. So we really have to think about deep system change. System-wide transformations, and we can think of agroecology within food sovereignty as enabling that deep transformation. And yeah, I was thinking about La Via Campesina, current debates, also the Land Workers Alliance, and trying to think, well, what should be the next phase of advocacy, campaign, political mobilization? So if you don't mind, I'd like to come up with some very broad headlines which I think can start shifting the system. I don't want to work within the existing system. I want to move out of it. What does that mean? Yeah. So just some broad headings. There's really a need to reinvent modernity and ideas of progress. Currently, we have a vision of modernity where there's no future for farmers, indigenous peoples, and pastoralists. They've been written off by all kinds of genocidal, economic policies. Similarly, linked with that, it's rejecting the idea of development as an ever-expanding process of commodification of nature and social relations. And it's putting at the center, ideas of the good life like buen vivir, degrowth, ecological swaraj, and other versions of the good life which are coming up from grassroots movement around the world. The second one, which is really important, and it's always been important for La Via Campesina and indigenous peoples, it's guaranteeing rights to land, seeds, and natural resources, and control over the means of production. Control over the means of production. And it's protecting individual and collective rights to land, water, seeds, and natural resources. It's about democratizing natural resource governance and, of course, redistributing through agrarian reforms and regulating land-based investments. The other big one is healing the metabolic rift, the delinking of agriculture and nature. So that's where agroecology has a role to play, permaculture, the transition stuff that you mentioned, but also an emphasis on relocalizing agri-food systems based on short food chains and circular models that move away from globalized, fossil fuel intensive, linear supply chains. And I'm not talking here about the circular economy ideas embraced by the World Economic Forum. I'm thinking much more of encouraging circular metabolism based on the degrowth in the use and consumption of materials. The fourth one, which is really important, is decolonizing knowledge and research, transforming knowledge production through power equalizing processes based on cognitive and intersectional justice. It's also about transforming the existing public research system, which is thoroughly inadequate and receives very little money to do work on agroecology. Most of the R&D money goes for industrial food and farming. So how do you transform, how do you democratize public research in universities and many other places to serve the common good rather than private interests? key to this, and you've mentioned it, is the idea of supporting and strengthening local organizations and networks to build countervailing power, to shift power relations. And with that, very important, it's achieving much more gender and intersectional justice. La Via Campesina realizes this, and the women groups in La Via Campesina say very clearly that unless violence against women in its various forms is stopped, there will never be any food sovereignty and never just agroecology. So it's tackling these multiple overlapping and intertwined structures of oppression using that intersectional lens. Remember, we've got gender, ethnicity, disability, neurodivergence, which we heard about this morning. It was lovely to hear about that, and race. The next one, which is really important, is rethinking, reinventing economics. We can't stay within the same economic box. We have to reinvent economics to move out of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And I just want to highlight one here, the need to holistically integrate productive labor with the reproductive labor of care of both women and nature through an economics of care. And then the final one, and I'll shut up, democratizing governance, democratizing politics. It's enabling people's participation in the co-production of knowledge, policies, and institutional choices. It's, say, basta with the current democratic deficit. How do we put people, their knowledge, their wishes, which are contradictory, but how do they come in and deliberate and co-produce solutions for our troubled times? And that also entails decentralizing and redistributing power in much more polycentric and horizontal governance webs, both in and between territories. So thinking less about the state, the vertical structures. Can we have other forms of governance that are based much more on horizontality, inclusion, peer-to-peer processes, checks and balances also, other governance architectures? And with that, really important to address the corporate capture of agri-food systems, and that's happening in a very big way currently with various corporations, financial investors, big groups like the World Economic Forum, promoting multi-stakeholder forms of governance and getting rid of multilateralism, one country, one vote. They're resetting the agenda for the governance of food and agriculture, and this is a very perilous moment. And that has to be blocked, right? So these are big, big issues. I know it's a bit daunting, huh? Yeah. But we have to think big. The other side is thinking super big, right? It's really thinking super big in terms of the fourth industrial revolution for agriculture, sourcing raw materials from the moon and other planets. No, they really are thinking big. We need to think big by coming together, right? Recognizing differences, but also convergences. How do we deal with this polycrisis? And how do we create a better world for ourselves, our kids? Yeah, and that's key. And with that, I think I would say there's still a lack of audacity. We need to say, this is what we want, basta. Or what they told you, take the land, right? We have to seize the moment and change the paradigm, right? And not leave any elephants in the room, one of them being international finance, global finance, and we could decide to talk about that, but I ought to shut up now. But not leaving any elephants in and creatively remaking the world and many possible worlds. That's essential. And for me, that's all part of agroecology, food sovereignty, and the search for a better world. And I don't want to think within the boundaries of existing reality. We have to reinvent many, many other realities. And groups like this play, I think, a fundamental role as catalysts, facilitators, midwives, to give birth to other societies wherever we are, in peri-urban, urban, rural areas, in the north, the south, etc. All right, I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah, I like to add his point because as La Via Campesina, we are fighting 17 years to get a kind of farmer's right, like a peasant right, declaration on the rights of the peasant and other people working in rural areas. It's like now it's like a UN recognized because we had a huge fight last 18 years to bring as a declaration to the as a rights to the peasants. Now it's in the UN recognized. And also, as he's mentioned, it's like especially we need to talk with the governance because it's like who's get the government. It's our right. We vote for them. And now it's like with the UNDROP, Colombian government trying to bring as a legal statement in the rights of the peasant in their own government. And Nepal, they're trying to bring the new act to the using the instrument in the UNDROP. And we are pushing other governments like Sri Lanka, we are also pressuring. And this instrument used for the farmers organization get their rights in their own countries. They're trying to tackle with the governments to get their rights through this instrument. Now it's really good as a La Via Campesina. We bring that instrument to use to get our rights through the sense of the right base, through the tackle with the governments. That's also good sense. Yes, like he mentioned, we really need to work on the right base, how we change the political regime through the get our rights. That's we are doing La Via Campesina with now. We are trying to ratify it in the local governance. Thank you.
I just wanted to add that one of the things I think we can do is to be pointing out the contradictions and the opportunities that are created by the poly-crisis. And the one that's really struck me forcefully over the last few years, but particularly in the autumn when the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission report on the cost of ill health created by the food system came out. We've got this real opportunity to get the government to put a lot more investment into food and farming, to create a healthy system to cut the costs. I mean, £268 billion of health costs from people being treated but also being out of work. If that could be shifted, that would be absolutely transformative, and we've got to really raise that as something that gets changed. And it's not just in the UK, that's happening globally, and it's because of these globalized agri-food businesses that are pressing for unhealthy food. But I think we've all got to be speaking that truth to power to get the money shifted into investing in the farming systems that are going to provide good health.
Yeah, I was actually just going to mention kind of elms really, because the second half of your question was about what governments should do and whether agroecology, I guess, is a term that we want kind of on the agenda of politicians and so on. And I guess because food isn't defined as a public good in our society, and elms is moving away from this area-based payment system and into like a public good-based payment system, that means that hopefully more of the sort of social goods that agroecology provides will be like rewarded under elms, which I think is a positive thing. And I don't think that's ever going to be at the heart of what agroecology is. We do these things because it's the right thing to do. And then it is really helpful that some of the kind of inequalities in the system are addressed through government funding, I guess. So yeah, I was just going to kind of say that really, that I think that some of the work that organisations that we're allied with in Landworkers Alliance have put into the kind of contributing towards elms has been, I think, a step in the right direction, is a positive thing. And yeah, I think that's kind of...
Thank you. Thanks all. Did you want to say a little bit more? Yeah.
Just not to dodge that question, what can the state do? It's a very difficult one, because in our discussions very often we identify problems and we come up with recommendations and we expect the state to implement them, when the state is often a culprit in making these problems through policy choices or previous history, through colonialism, etc. So how do I square that in my head? I think one important to just note that within governments there are different people, and some are champions of change, some are progressives, and those are the people you try and work with, and this is what the Land Workers does in DEFRA, etc. And you can go so far that. Similarly, different levels of government offer more opportunities. I think central governments are probably very, very problematic in most countries because they're captured by corporate interests. There's a revolving door process that's institutionalized. They're often working for their mates rather than the public good. But you go down to provincial levels, municipal levels, there are more possibilities there. So I think there are multiple lanes of engagement with governments. You have to be savvy. You can work with champions of change, perhaps more at the municipal level, provincial level. But I think, personally, I've reached the conclusion that it's a mistake to think that governments will fix it. They're part of representative democracy, and if you look at the history of representative democracy, when it came about, it was a response to people's attempt to rule themselves during the French Revolution, for example. It scared the bourgeoisie immensely. So they came up with representative democracy, it'd be safer. And we have representative democracies that are really problematic in terms of serving the needs of not just the poor, but middle-class people. So how do we reinvent governance? That was the point I'm making. What models are there out there? And there have been people who've broken away from the center to come up with their own forms of governance that are inclusive. So there's the Zapatista in Mexico, but also confederal municipal forms of governance, for example, in Rojava, in Kurdistan. These are very, very interesting models because they're experimenting with different architectures of governance. And they're showing that it's possible, right? And they're including democratic process, gender inclusion, ecology. They haven't sorted out all the problems, but it's a very, very interesting dynamic. And I would suggest that those are the models that are perhaps better suited to develop adaptive management of landscapes, right? But also adaptive governance. So it's, don't consolidate the state. How do we break it up? But at the same time, maintain all these ideas of accountability, two-way accountability, and checks and balances. There's a whole area of work there that needs to be explored much, much more, I think, by the agroecology and food security in a daring way. And we are running out of time. Yeah, so.
And actually, I was just going to quickly say, just because actually also how we don't replicate the systems that you're talking about in our own farms and our own projects as well. And this can be in the not-for-profit sector as well. It's like how, when we're thinking about how we treat each other on our farms, in our land work projects, are we doing that in a way that is building a better world for each other, or are we just unthinkingly almost replicating these oppressive systems as well? So I just kind of wanted to mention that too. So.
Thanks all for holding the complexity of, the role of the state in grassroots. I guess, for me, in asking that question, there was this implicit assumption that I hold of maybe the state we shouldn't be involved at all. But it's fully a grassroots movement. Maybe we shouldn't be asking the state for anything. But I really appreciate the answers that are bringing in the fact that there is a really big role for legislation and pushing for peasant rights, and also fully realizing agroecology means dismantling the state as we know it. So thank you so much for holding all of that complexity in your answers. I have one final question about organics, and then we will move to the Q&A section. And the question is, how do you see the agroecology movement operating alongside organics, alongside legally protected certification schemes? I guess in the theme of not trying to ignore that those movements or certification schemes exist and operate alongside us. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. I think they're operating alongside each other very effectively and have been doing for a really long time, and I don't see that there's a conflict. I mean, one thing I often say to people when they say, well, isn't agroecology, through not being certified, isn't there a real risk of greenwash with it? I say, well, if I were to see a product advertised as being agroecological in a supermarket, I absolutely wouldn't buy it, because that's selling through the supermarket system is absolutely the antithesis of what agroecology is about. And I think it's really important that we spread the message amongst our grassroots movements that agroecology is about short, farmer-focused routes to market. It's not a way of selling products. And likewise, I think regenerative farming, it's a really, really important part of the whole transformation. There are thousands of farmers coming across from being conventional and using quite a lot of destructive practices to becoming more sustainable through the regenerative movement. I don't think it should be used as a marketing label, but it's very much a movement, and the flexibility is one of its strengths. So I think that's also really important. But at the same time, supermarkets do exist, and you have got longer supply chains, and that's where organic certification and biodynamic certification really comes into its own. So I really passionately believe that they all need to work alongside each other. We've got to have these movements, and we need to have the certification. I just wanted to add a quick thing on the last question, because when I was saying about the health costs, I wanted to juxtapose the 268 billion that's spent, the cost of the bad food that we have, against the 2.4 billion, an absolute fraction that's spent on subsidies for agriculture at the moment. And really, unless there's a massive increase in the amount that's put into investing in better agriculture, we're just not going to be able to bring about the changes. I'm going to have to leave this session a bit early because I'm going to be going to lunch with the Minister of Food Security, Daniel Zeitner, to make a pitch for better payment for a small-scale market garden scheme. So I'm going to be very audacious there and try and really get better payment for this. But we need to be operating on multiple levels. We need to be dismantling the capital system, but we've also got to be operating in the system we've got at the moment. And that is requiring the public money for public goods so that people can stay afloat. So I think we've got to be working at all these different levels simultaneously. But I'll hand over to someone else.
Thanks, Bea. I think now we'll move on to the Q&A section. And what I'll do is I'll take one from the floor and then one from online and alternate. If we've got a mic for anyone who, if you have a question, if you want to put your hand up. Yes, the person, I can't see who it is, but you're wearing a black jumper just over there. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for a thought-provoking panel. My name is Lydia Cabral. I work at the Institute of Development Studies. And my question is around the point I think Michel made around people's power. So what does that look like in a context of rising ultra-right movements in society? rising anti-migrant narratives, which are connected also to ideas around locally homegrown food. So I see a danger in societies, not just the state or corporations, but Edwin, you said we might be the goodies, but there's a lot of people out there who see these things in a very different light. So what does people power mean in this context? Thank you.
Big question. Thank you very much for that. I think one element of the response there is creating opportunities and spending time in popular education, in conscientization processes within neighborhoods, schools, and in the country, to debunk some of the far-right myths that are propagated. Popular education around citizenship, nurturing citizenship, alternative forms of making decisions. I think there's a lot of information people don't have, and given the power of social media and television, etc., we kind of cut out from whole traditions of education, political education, that are very important in countering the xenophobia and extremism of the far right, as well as very sectarian views about anti-Jews, anti-Islam people, or anti-LGBTQ. And we need to have spaces where we talk about how do we make our societies more inclusive. How do we foreground love and care for others rather than hate? That's really important. And I think that's a prerequisite for fighting what you're describing. At the same time, we have to recognize that many people are turning to the far right because of the growing precarity in society. If I look in France, I'm half French. The far right movements in France have gained enormously, and this coincides at a time of growing precarity, growing poverty. So there's been very little thought about creating safety nets and material security for people. And perhaps here conversations that would be useful would be, how do we think about introducing an unconditional guaranteed citizen income for everyone, regardless of means testing, something the Swiss tried to do in a referendum a few years ago. So how do we provide material security and time for people to develop their own projects, but also not have to worry about all the things they worry when they don't have money, paying food bills and energy bills, etc. If there's organized scarcity of that kind, I think it's a very fertile terrain for the far right. And that's what we've seen in many countries. We should remember that the gap between the very, very rich, the hyper-rich, and the majority of us has widened enormously, and particularly over the last 10 years. So poverty is increasing, precarity in this country, food precarity is huge. In France too, we just look at some of the reports that probably been mentioned in this meeting. That has to be tackled as part of a process of countering the rise of the far right. So how do we attend to the material conditions, as well as how do we encourage broader views, cultural shifts through popular education and coming together? That would be, part of my response to your question, but it is a very complex question, and you're absolutely right to ask it. I'm happy talking more afterwards. Yeah.
I was just really quickly going to say, yeah, obviously we need to kick the far right out of the conversation, and that can be debunking the false solutions that they're giving to these, these problems that the precarity that people face. So debunking those false solutions. Another thing that I think that La Via Campesina is really amazing for is spreading stories and spreading solidarity work. And so the work that is done in La Via for migrant solidarity globally, I think is really important. There's actually a session going on at the same time as this one, which is about it's about some work that Catherine was doing with Land Workers Alliance around the migrant visas schemes for agricultural labourers, and I think that's one that anyone who's interested in this sort of thing should kind of try and follow up on and think about, because there's a particular situation where my understanding is that some migrant workers were brought here to pick food, and then when the working conditions meant that they left the farm, they then became essentially illegal and unhoused. So those sort of situations, like really building that solidarity and then linking that to what's happening in Spain with North African migrant workers, what's happening in Latin America. So yeah, I think that that's also really important. So it's building the resistance, building the solidarity, and debunking the bullshit. Oh, sorry, I probably should have said that on the internet. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for those answers. I just wanted to add a thought. That maybe it's also about showing that we have solutions to the precarity that the world is facing. We have some answers, and we need to make them attractive. Yeah, I don't know, that was just a thought. I'm going to go to an online question now. One from Marie Amelie said, could we hear the panel's views on the term regenerative as a wider concept of being in the world and incorporating agroecology?
Well, I just said, I think regenerative is a really, really important concept, because it is providing an open door for many farmers to change their ways to become much more sustainable. I think that agroecology and regenerative can go very much alongside each other in parallel, and I hope that there'll be much more coming together of those. I think one of the things that the regenerative movement isn't really addressing at the moment is the whole social and political side of the transformation that we need. It's not really looking at who's doing the farming, who's got the access to land, who's got the skills. And well, I think the skills bit is being done more effectively, and the sharing of knowledge. And I think that democratization of knowledge is happening much more effectively. But I think there's a lot that the regenerative movement could be doing to be much more politically and socially connected. So yes, I think I would say regenerative is a really, really important part of the whole solution, but it would be great to see more political questioning and social improvement going on within that. Does anyone want to? Yeah.
Thanks, Fee. We'll go to the room. Yes, the person in the green blazer.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing conversation, everybody. Michel, you said, what was it, organised scarcity. I think, I'm not sure you said organised, but engineered or deliberate. And I'm guessing that was deliberate. But meaning, I'm just reading Jason Hickel's book, Less is More. And I like with many things, I have a lot of criticisms, but it's very good. And it's a must read, because it does explain a lot of background to the financial framework we're all having to work in. But that brings me to a sort of question, but it's the facets have already been aired, but it still comes back to this difficulty that this is sane conversation. It's vital for the future of the earth, as has been said, and it's urgent. That's the other point. And so getting this information to where I'm farming in a very small way, talking to a few people that I know more closely, they're not receiving this. And how does this and what it really means for the future of a future, and then how do we get that into those arenas? How do we, and then it comes to this other thing, how do we challenge the general media, which is an agent of all that is wrong I've never used the word capitalism because I perhaps didn't understand what it meant, so I avoid isms of any kind, and I like to talk from first principles, but now I'm starting to accept it's a very useful word. Thank you.
Thank you for that really important question. Organised scarcity, I did use the word, and you mentioned finance. I just want to give an example. We hear it a lot in I didn't present I've worked in agroecological research for many years with farmer networks, and always been struck by the lack of funds to do agroecological research. And when you look into the whole system, and this is work I've done with colleagues in the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, you do realize that there's an organized scarcity of funds for agroecological research and re-territorializing local food systems. In the same way, there's an organized scarcity of funds for the NHS, public education, and so on. There are minuscule amounts of money going into agroecological research. Most of it supports industrial food and farming research. And the narrative, the dominant narrative that we're hearing from the media and governments is we don't have the money, right? There isn't enough money. We can't fund this. We can't put more money in the NHS. We can't put more money into care and so on. We can't put more money into it. We're strapped. We can't provide money to the global south to adapt to climate change, right? What we'll do, we'll give loans rather than grants to the global south and further cause their indebtedness. And yet, when you look at the overall financial architecture, realize there is no dearth of money. It's just a question of distribution. And there are various mechanisms that are currently being attempted, and this has come out really over the last 2 years, to bring back money to work for the public good. So the idea of a global wealth tax, a modest 2% tax would raise additional funding to the tune of $250 billion US, just by taxing 3,000 billionaires. There are currently 3,000 billionaires worldwide. A modest tax of 2% would raise an enormous amount of money. Similarly, we've heard about the need to tax corporate windfall profits from agribusiness as well as oil companies. But we can go further. We can abolish tax havens where a lot of the money made by very, very small groups, corporations and hyper-rich people is stashed away. So, and I could go on. There are many, many sources of money available, but the dominant narrative is that there's scarcity. And the scarcity is organized through the mantra on the social media, the news, etc. And we tend to accept that, we normalize it. And I think we need to open up a conversation and say, no, there's an abundance, there are possibilities rather than scarcity and impossibility. That's what I meant by organized scarcity. And it links with some of Jason Hickel's point in his book, I think, too. Am I missing out on something you asked? Oh, yes, yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, thank you. So I think events like this are really important. I always view the Oxford Real Farming Conference as a moment where people learn from each other, and we have very, very different people and different knowledges are respected. This is a very important learning space, but that has to be amplified and multiplied across the land. And I go back to that point on the need to invest heavily in popular education programs in safe spaces, so as to reclaim knowledge that is useful for the common good, rather than replicating the messages received by social media and media, most of which is owned by a very, very small number of hyper-rich individuals. And inevitably what they spout out reflects and reinforces the status quo. So that's really important, to find spaces where we can learn from each other, we can go deeper and build consciousness for action. So it goes back to the first point about how do you fight the far right. I think this is really important. That's all I would say. But thank you for that question. I'm happy talking more about it.
Thanks, Michel. We only have a few minutes left. I'm just wondering if there's anyone who is new to the conference or new to farming who might have a question and hasn't asked one yet. If not, we'll go to an online one. I think we've already had a question. Yeah. Okay.
New to the conference, but hi everyone, thank you for the panelists and the audience to be here, very important. I am coming from the University of Coimbra. I'm doing research in the interface between research and practice, and I've been asking these questions over several conferences, never gotten an answer. I'm hoping to hear some hopeful news, but how do we build a strong movement that can reach the lobby at the political level here in Europe if we don't have a very, very clear definition of agroecology? In my thesis, when I was a graduate student, I dig deeper into the definition of agroecology, and it's a concept that has several principles from Danieleni 2016, FAO 2018, HLP 2019, but how can we push to have a strong lobby with all the organic movement, regenerative, agroecological farmers in it, if we don't have a clear definition? Thank you.
Brief answers, because we've got 1 or 2 minutes.
In my limited experience, actually, it's just about making specific asks, because that's always quite useful. So this is from like ECVC, from La Via Campesina, you know, like having achieved UNDROP was a massively important step. When ECVC campaign to, say, the European Commission or the Parliament, they are making very specific requests that are built out of a consensus of member organisations. So this is the European coordination of La Via. There are lots of organisations that are part of that. Landworkers Alliance are part of that. So, because your question was about Europe, it's like when a position from ECVC is thought out, we can use the term agroecology, but unless we're asking for specific things like fair pricing or, you know, regulation of seeds or being able to use your own seed varieties or whatever it is, I think it's about the asks, and so the movements is important and the goals of the movement. Does that make sense what I'm saying? But yeah, I also appreciate your point. Yes. So it's, yeah. Absolutely. So that's it. So I guess it's about alliance building and finding common ground, but I recognise that it's a difficult thing to do. I just want, have you got any closing remarks? Because I realise we've been chatting a lot, and you want to add something?
Yeah, it's Europe. No. I'm not close with Europe, ECVC, but it's as a general idea of the La Via. We think we're trying to move forward with like that, especially with the Nielani. That's our main goal, how we come together to the all movements, all CSOs and all researchers. We're trying to move forward with that. It's hard, it's difficult, but we're trying to connect with that line to how we move forward with the same line with the all kind of movements to come together, especially with we have experience with especially the UN treaties, like a seed treaty and climate COP, and this all, we're trying to move forward together as all movements. We're trying to, but it's so hard and difficult, yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time now. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the speakers. If you give a round of applause. Thank
Thank you, Claire.
Have a great rest of your conference.